Well, it's a special time for us as we're finally getting a new series of Inside Number 9, which can only mean one thing: watching 6 tales from the minds of Steve Pemberton and Reece Shearsmith and still thinking about them the week after they air. But what does the new Series 7 have in store for us? Well, each week I'll be going through each episode and giving my analysis and general thoughts on them. I did try to do this previously with Series 6 without a script, but yeah, they weren't that good. So now I think it's time to improve on my work and my analysis on this wonderful show. So without further ado, welcome everybody to my review of this episode from Inside Number 9, Series 7. Even though at the time of writing the script this is the only episode of Series 7 that's aired, I'm kind of surprised they chose Merrily, Merrily as the opening episode, at least in comparison to the other series of this show. The first episode in the series of Inside Number 9 is usually a comedy-focused episode, like Series 2 was The Lack of Shet, Series 5 had The Referee's a Wanker, Series 6 had Wuthering Heist, and so on. Although there is some comedy to it, particularly at the start, Merrily, Merrily is a more so somber and quiet episode when compared to the rest. In this episode, we follow Lawrence, who is arranged for a ride down a lake in an old pedalo emblazoned with the number 9 with his old university friends, Callum and Darren. But things don't go according to plan as Darren misreads the invitation and brings his new girlfriend Donna along for the ride, and naturally, arguments start to occur, leaving them to realise whether things are better left in the past or not. Not to mention, Lawrence starts to see a mysterious man on the lake's banks and is overly protective of a bag he brought along with him for the ride. Merrily Merrily is a more character-driven episode than plot-driven, which should be apparent as its main premise is simply a small cast of characters interacting with each other, in this case the old university trio: Lawrence, the straight man of the group, Darren, the more rambunctious of the trio, and Callum, the successful and jovial character. More humour is also injected throughout the episode with the inclusion of Donna, Darren's girlfriend, who is also played by Diane Morgan, who is no stranger to playing airheaded and comedic characters such as Philomena Kunk in Charlie Brooker's Mind Wipe. But, in regards to the actors in this episode, we also have to talk about what most people will probably remember this episode for, since this marks the return of Mark Gatiss as Stephen Reece's projects. For those of you who don't know, Gatiss was a part of a comedy group alongside Steve Pemberton, Reece Shearsmith and Jeremy Dyson named The League of Gentlemen, which is arguably their most popular work, at least in the UK. Gatiss also appeared in an episode of Stephen Reece's previous project, Psychoville, which was over a decade ago, so we really believe that this is a reunion between the trio's characters and, in a sense, the three gents. Not to mention, Mark Gatiss' character is quite lovely, and he easily has some of my personal favourite lines in the episode.
Have you been in 5 Dice, Callum?
Oh, at least.
This episode is more so focused around Lawrence's journey more so than the other characters, as he eventually reveals that the reason he invited the others along was to actually spread his dead wife's ashes, which he's eventually successful in doing so. Lawrence to me is the most interesting character in this episode, as unlike the others, he's too focused on the past. He's working at the university he once attended, he's still not over his wife's death, even building her memorial to where they married, and he wants to let his old friend see her out and say attended his wedding. His clinginess to the old is even represented through the pedalo, as it's quite an old design, and throughout the episode you can hear a constant whirring from it, almost like a heartbeat, signifying that the past is still in Lawrence's mind when he's pedaling.
Will there be cabins on the boat to freshen up?
Who wants a bevy?
And this ultimately circulates to what the episode is truly about: grief and holding on to the past. Obviously this is shown with Lawrence's character as he's still not over his wife's death or even his old university days, but in contrast, Darren and Callum want to move past, well, the past, but in doing so they have to come to terms with a job that they hate doing or struggle to deal with dyslexia which just can't go away. Surprisingly, Donna is the most well-rounded character out of the cast, as she's always acted the way she is now, even as a kid. Maybe it's just because she didn't go to university. But as for Callum and Darren, they still have things in the present to make them go on, such as Callum's dog daughters and Darren's book to help dyslexic kids and adults like him. We have seen grief tackled on the show before to varying extents, such as in Diddle Diddle Dumpling or Tom and Jerry, which coincidentally also have characters played by Reece dealing with said grief. In this episode for Lawrence, the past has an iron grip around him, and we can tell that Bonnie was very close to his heart. I mean, why else would he even devote such time into this lake trip with his old pals? But we can see that he still wants to move on. He wants to remember his wife for who she was and ultimately send her out in a blaze of glory.
Burn bright, Molly. Burn bright.
But, in a sort of bittersweet manner, I kind of think Lawrence loves his wife to the point where he still wants to be with her, even if it means he'll die. At certain points in the episode, he notices and even waves to the ferryman, who we know at the end of the episode is Charon, a ferryman in Greek mythology who guides dead spirits to the afterlife but the river Styx. Maybe this is meant to imply that Lawrence has had suicidal thoughts and wanted to be with Bonnie again in death, and perhaps he knew that the water would give him hypothermia and guided the peddler to the weeds in order to force the group to an unmanageable situation that they can't just breeze past in an instant. Or maybe I'm just going crazy for this analysis. I mean, this is meant to be a review as well, so let's get back to talking about what I liked about this episode. I think that the dynamic between the cast was exceptional, and it obviously made for good humour knowing the comedy background between them. I was also fond of the direction in this episode from newcomer Al Campbell, who was coincidentally also in Charlie Brooker's screenwipe with Diane Morgan. Directing in an episode set entirely in a lake can't be easy, and there were quite a few nice sampling shots sprinkled in. Not to mention, Christian Henson's score once again complements this episode quite well, perfectly matching the somber tone and atmosphere that is so prevalent throughout this episode of Inside Number 9. Or I guess, Outside Number 9 in this case, since to date this is probably the only episode of the whole show to take place entirely outdoors, so that's a neat tidbit. Also, did anyone else think it was a missed opportunity to not have Jeremy Dyson play the ferryman in this episode? I know he's not an acting person, and it might have been a bit fan-wanky towards fans of the League of Gentlemen like myself, but it would have been nice. But who knows, maybe he'll appear in a future episode of Number 9.
We're three of them.
Don't worry about them. They're fine.
Where are they?
On the other side.
Thank God.
In conclusion, Merrily Merrily is a bit of an odd choice to have as a starting episode for this new series, but on its own, it's a pretty good episode of the show, dealing with grief and how the past could bleed into the present. With some delightful characters and dialogue to it, not to mention some nice cinematography and a score that perfectly complements it, this episode is one of Number 9's surprisingly bittersweet affairs. And this is meant to be a light episode to introduce the audience, I dread to think how dark the other episodes will go.